I want people around me to succeed. So I genuinely believe I am only as good as the people I surround myself with. It's not just a career decision for me. There's a family conversation that goes, are you ready for me now not to be mentally present for the next 6 months or so? I'll be well outside my comfort zone.
Did you ever feel like you wanted to give it all up and go and find something different?
100%. In my first 2 to 3 months, I remember just literally saying, I can't do this. This is insane. I've never been spoken to this way before.
So today we're joined by Sharon Maguire, who is the Chief Operations Officer for Cynergy Bank. Sharon's got a fascinating background. She spent 6.5 years in the Middle East as a financial services executive, working for various financial services businesses. She's a female leader who cut her teeth in incredibly male-dominated financial services environments. So that broad range of experience, coupled with her authentic, dynamic leadership style, make her an incredible individual. And I was privileged to have this conversation today. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Sharon, welcome to the podcast. So diving straight in, this is talking about your background, your experiences, your journey into leadership. And I think one of the things that really kind of shone through in our preparation was actually you've got to where you are without having a degree.
Yeah.
And it would be great to understand from your perspective, was that a conscious decision early in your career to not go to university and get a degree and go straight into the workplace? And how has that impacted you through your career to date?
Yeah, sure. So it was, when I look back on it, it was probably a little bit of a young decision, if that makes sense. So I did my GCSEs at school, went to grammar school, got good GCSE results, and didn't, to the horror of my parents, want to do A-levels. And I was competing quite seriously on horses at the time, very passionate about horses, and kind of wanted to go down that route. My parents weren't overly pleased, if I'm being blunt with you. And they were very much, okay, well, we can support you, but you need to take a very specific route. What are you going to actually do? So I actually left school and went and qualified to become a riding instructor. So I still have my full qualifications for that. And actually what I learned through that process, though, was I really enjoyed the business side of running a kind of livery yard or a competition yard. And I started becoming quite interested in that. So I did do a national diploma in business studies. So I went and sort of smartened myself up on that a little bit further. And then, yes, it was a very conscious decision that from there, I could have done a top-up year to have topped up to a degree. And I decided that I really wanted to just get out into the workplace and get experience. By this point, my passion for horses hadn't gone away, but the practical reality of could I really live life like that? I was working 6 days a week, earning £35 a week, living in a caravan. And I think I thought, right, I actually quite enjoyed the business side of this, so I'd rather get into something on the business side. So yeah, I very consciously at that stage said, actually, don't really want to go to uni. I want to go and get real world practical experience. So I applied to a small marketing consultancy, which is based in Mortlake in London. Got myself a role, and that's basically where my career kicked off. So it isn't your standard route that most people would take.
Into banking executive careers.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's a different start, right? But then so as you then started to progress through your career, in those early stages, did you find that not having that degree held you back at all?
Yeah, so I think it made it incredibly challenging. I wouldn't use the words held me back because I think I managed to get where I wanted to go, but through real tenacity and having to sort of go above and beyond. So I think for so long, and even today, so many of the big corporates just have this tick box of must have a degree. So I joined the marketing consultancy, and they specialized in working with financial services companies. That's kind of the link into financial services. And then as I started looking at the much bigger banks, et cetera, they all said, must have a degree, must have a degree. And I thought, well, this is crazy. I might not have a degree, but I've got more experience than these people that have been at uni having degrees because I've been out actively kind of serving and working with clients of this consultancy.
Of course.
So I was just quite pushy and I applied anyway. So I used to write covering letters that said, I don't have a degree, but you really should meet me. And this is why you should meet me. And, I did get a number of interviews on that basis. And my first role from the consultancy was then actually with NatWest Stockbrokers, who I went to work for, obviously one of the big brand banks,
of course.
And got through the door there. So, Yes, it's definitely made a difference. And I feel like I had to push harder through my early career. And then even like later in my career, when I moved to City, that was also must have a degree. And I kind of wrote a similar letter later on, and I managed to get through the door. So yeah, for a while you have to kind of, in interview, I had to really explain myself. I really felt like it was being really frowned upon of, well, why didn't you do that? That sounds like a really odd route to have taken. And you had to really be able to explain yourself and push hard. So yes, it definitely made it harder.
I'm also curious to understand. So I also don't have a degree.
Okay.
Nor does my fellow director, co-founder.
Okay.
And I think we have almost found ourselves having a bit of a chip on our shoulder as a result of that, as we've gone through our career. I'm curious to understand from your perspective. So once you were in the door at these early stages in your career, were you having to over-explain yourself because you didn't have a degree? Were you disguising that fact? How did you deal with that?
I don't think I did have to over-explain myself. And I don't think I did have to necessarily work much harder. But just with the language you just used, did I disguise that fact? I tried to never talk about it.
Right.
So I never have really talked about it until much more recently in my career, where I now feel safe to say it and talk about it. So yeah, I would always avoid the topic. And I can remember being in conversations in the workplace where people are talking about, where did you go to uni? What did you do? And kind of sidling off a little bit, thinking, I don't really want to get into this and say that at this stage of my career, I haven't got a degree. Yeah. So yes, I would say I kind of tried to hide from it a bit in those not a bit, I did hide from it in those conversations. But I wouldn't say it made a big difference. Once I was in the workplace, I don't think it made a big difference at all.
No, I know exactly what you mean. I remember being at a lunch once with a client, and one of my colleagues, who was one of our associates, and I remember the conversation came up, and I think they'd been to the same uni.
Right.
And it kind of went around the table, and I was thinking, oh no, what am I going to say?
It's going to be my turn.
And I was like, well, I don't have a degree. And then as soon as I said it, I thought, that didn't have the impact that I thought. No one actually cares at all, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you do over worry about it.
Yeah, it's a mental thing, isn't it? But I'm also intrigued. So you talked about when you were at City, changing the policy from, I think you said it was must have a degree to there's a preference for a degree.
Yeah.
How did you go about doing that?
Yes, I've done that in a few organizations where you're going through your standard HR processes and you're recruiting. And obviously part of that standard process is there's a standard job description and the must-haves are on there. And many of them at the organizations I've worked for have said must have a degree. So the conversations I would start with, why are we saying this? And I'd get an answer and I'd say, but you hired me and you think I'm doing an okay job, this is going okay. And so it was really pushing for at least us to be able to say in these organizations that, okay, if you want to have something on there about a degree, it should say degree preferable as opposed to must have a degree. So, there's a range of how far an organization will agree to go.
Of course.
So preference at least rather than must. But I think almost just kind of removing it entirely actually would create even further diversity in teams. And for me, people talk a lot when interviewing. They talk a lot about make sure you've got gender diversity and diversity of background. But when they talk about diversity of background, I don't think people actively think about having people that have a degree, don't have a degree, have an MBA, et cetera, and looking at the range. When I'm looking at different people or interviewing different people for roles, I really like to try and consider that real diversity of background. And I encourage my teams to do the same. Don't just go for the same types of people with the same types of backgrounds, same types of degrees, because you get a very different thought process from different people.
It's so true, right? And that social mobility issue, I think, is probably less talked about than other diversity issues, right? Which is somewhat problematic, I think, because then you do create ceilings for individuals in the workplace, and you see it time and time again, right? I think we definitely see that, but I do think the world is changing. I think things are evolving. I think you're probably less likely to see that on job descriptions now, where it's a must-have, right? Which is a positive thing.
Definitely, yeah. And I think the other thing, or how I felt, is what I brought to the table was I just had 2 years more experience than everyone else.
Right.
That doesn't make me right. That doesn't mean I always would get things right versus someone else. But I had real life practical experience. They had lots of really deep technical experience in what they'd studied. And actually, the combination of those two things together in a team is a good thing.
Yeah, that's so true. It's interesting, actually, within our business, we've kind of changed from, we have got a team of graduates and, we look for a specific profile there, but we've also started to look more at second jobbers. Who maybe don't have the same degree. And it's worked really, really well because, like you say, that experience in the workplace, it gives you that little bit of an edge, especially at the beginning of your career, because you've just got that little bit more know-how, right?
Yes. And it also might mean you've done some different things. So when I think of the bigger banks that I worked at, people would come through the graduate process and then they've kind of only done what I call that big bank process. Whereas even just by the 2 years I spent at a marketing consultancy, we worked for public sector, we worked for private sector, we worked in the advertising industry, we worked in the publishing industry, as well as in the financial services industry. But so you then had a range of clients and problems and customer solutions to deliver, etc. And you weren't always just thinking about it from a financial services perspective.
Which is great for everybody, right? And you touched on diversity there, but obviously being a female leader today is probably a little bit easier than it has been in the past. But you had that challenge as well as you were coming up through the ranks, right? And especially when you look at your career and your profile, you've always worked in heavily male-dominated environments, I presume. How did you tackle that?
Yes, I think the big thing I'd say is there's not a one-size-fits-all answer for it. And I guess probably the best examples to give of that. So when I've worked in what I call very large corporate, aggressive, male-dominated environments, I have had to really dial up my assertiveness. And I mean really dial it up. So I remember kind of moving from a corporate environment, but into a new, really big corporate male-dominated environment and kind of thinking, I feel like I don't exist. Like I just feel like my voice is not even being heard. I didn't feel like I was even being taken seriously. So really dialing up that assertiveness, I think, it's not a great term to use, but almost being able to shout louder.
Yeah.
And if I didn't do that, I was literally being drowned out. So I think that taught me probably, it was a hard lesson, but it taught me a great deal about resilience and it taught me about getting stuff done in the absolute toughest rooms. So it's not something I would want to see females go through. But I would say I tried to look for the best in everything. It really did teach me how to get stuff done in a tough environment. So I had to really, really dial it up in those environments. But then in contrast, if I think about when I've spent a number of years in the Middle East, I've spent over 6 years in the Middle East, it was almost the opposite. So because of the culture in the Middle East, it's very much relationship based and it was very much about building relationship and credibility and the outcomes of what you were delivering. And almost the louder you got over there, or I would get over there, particularly I would say as a female, the less credibility I had. So it was a massive switch actually from the environment I'd come from when I first landed in the Middle East to I actually really need to dial it down the other way. I need to be willing to slow down in terms of delivery because actually to get the delivery that I know I'm going to want medium and long term, I've got to build relationship and trust.
Right.
So they're different environments, but it's different to what you need to do.
Of course, that's fascinating. And in the first environment, when you first learnt that actually it was incredibly different to what you've had previously, or experiences you've had previously, did you ever feel like you wanted to give it all up and go and find something different?
100%. So in my first 2 to 3 months, I remember just literally saying, I can't do this.
Right.
Like this is insane. I've never been spoken to this way before. That's not a good thing, right? But I've never been spoken to this way. I just can't. I can't understand how I can't get anything done. I feel like I'm just not getting the space that I need, or the time, or the voice at the table that I need. But I am a very resilient person. I built a lot of resilience through that in itself. But you start to, I guess the way I look at these things is, well, okay, there's no point saying I can't. So what can you try? And you try different things and different ways of doing things. What was difficult back then is there there wasn't really like a female mentor to go to, or someone you could go and say, hey, how do you get stuff done in this place? But there were some females obviously in the environment higher up. And what I noticed, to be very blunt, is they were all incredibly assertive, and really had, dialed that up very much. And you start thinking, okay, that feels like the right way to go. So you try things a few times, they start working, and then that's what you start doing. I think today, what I see in organizations, and I certainly do a lot of this as well, is there's much more support for females. So in terms of helping a female dial up their voice if they're not being heard, in terms of helping a female to navigate their way through an organization or to influence, particularly if it's more male dominated, I think there is much more support to be able to do that.
It's really interesting, yeah. And I think it completely resonates as well. I suppose I'm curious to understand what gives you that drive, right? Because it's so easy, and it's great because we see the scale of change that's happening now, especially within financial services, the industry that we both spend a lot of time in, right? You can see that there is much more female presence in leadership teams, and there's still a long way to go. But if people like you hadn't fought through and built that resilience in the first place, we may not be in this position. So what gave you that drive? What stopped you from going, I want something easier than this?
I think if you go maybe a little bit deeper and back to sort of my foundations, my parents would be a strong answer to that. So my parents taught me a very, very strong work ethic, and particularly my mum. So back in, I guess, the 1970s, set up a road haulage business. So a male-dominated environment, female setting up a business like that and leading that. And she always kind of taught me to be very independent, and she taught me that I should grow up and make sure that, I could hold my own, I could look after myself, I shouldn't need to ask anyone for anything. So I think there was that in me always, if that makes sense. And I had that kind of sort of parental inspiration to continue to drive down that route. And then I think also, I think it was when you see the wins. So for me, when you actually see the ground that you can gain and the benefit that you can give to others as well by helping them through more difficult times, I just think it's that moment of when you get that satisfaction and it actually happens, that it just keeps you going. And
then you're like, oh, right,
I can do this. And I think that, you kind of get that buzz, right? I can do this. I can do this. I'm going to do more of this.
And then it's momentum.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's really cool. And the other way to look at it, I suppose, is actually if you're in that environment and it is rough and you're not treated with the respect that you deserve, it's actually probably quite a good training ground to develop that additional skill set, right, that you may not have had previously. Yeah. But then I often wonder, so you've talked about two very different types of cultures that you've operated in there, right? So how do you remain authentic and true to your own values whilst you're dialing up these different styles in such a drastic way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you do have to always remain true to yourself, because otherwise I think if you're trying to be someone else all the time, considering the amount of time and hours we spend at work, that would just become really exhausting.
Yeah, true.
But I think there's something in my values anyway, that I want people around me to succeed. So I genuinely believe I am only as good as the people I surround myself with. And if I want people to succeed, then I need to make sure that they're in the best environment for them. And we're not all the same. We're all different. I really believe in diversity because I think it does bring the best to teams. But if you're going to bring diversity in your teams, you have to be willing to flex, right? And to look at things with a different lens and to have a different style with different people. So it's not about not being me. It's about being me, which is someone who wants to bring the best out in other people. I find it, I like pace. And if I find someone I can work with that is very happy for me to be very direct, they just want clarity, they want decision, that's great. I enjoy that. It's like that's easy for me, if that makes sense. Yeah. But there are lots of people that I work with who actually, want to flip something on its head and have the debate around, well, okay, what if it doesn't work? What's the worst thing that could happen here? And actually I embrace that because that helps me to make sure that I don't go sort of too far in one direction without considering kind of other lenses or other consequences. So yeah, I don't think you're not being true to yourself. I think it's just around trying to bring out the best in others, which ultimately gives the best team. I know if I just kind of continued with my very fast-paced, decisive style, I'll get something wrong in the end, right? You're not perfect. So you've got, you need people around you who will say, okay, I hear you, but just hang on a minute. Let's talk about this. Let's debate that. And then you'll also have moments in leadership where things go wrong, or you've got really tough, critical decisions to make, and everyone looks at you and goes, can you just make a decision for me, right? So you're also, actually being able to be really decisive and, okay, this is what we're going to do, guys. Give people that assurance and that stability that they want is also important. I mean,
it's fascinating to hear you say that, because I think it's one of those things that it's actually really, really difficult to do in practice, right? Especially if you're the leader, it's your head on the block. Ultimately, you've made decisions, you're going a certain direction, and people are challenging you. Sometimes it's difficult to stop and listen and take that feedback on board, right? But it's clearly a skill that you've developed over time. How have you developed all of these different styles in reality? Is it literally trial by error, basically?
Yeah, so I would say it's because I've I guess, made myself work in different environments. And I say made myself, I sort of pause there, because it's like, did I consciously really think about that? I think the answer to that is yes. So I started off in what I call the really big banks. And then I took quite a leap to Aspirational. It was a big bank at the time, but it was to set up a standalone internet bank, which was called Project Aquarius at the time, and became Kahoot. And the mandate was very much, build it away from Abbey. We want the head office not in London, geographically away from Abbey. Build it as a standalone business. So it was very much felt like a startup. So a totally different environment. So you've got that. You've got the big corporate to what I call that real startup environment, back into a very big American corporate environment, and then kind of off into like the Middle East. So. And why did I want to go to the Middle East? Because I wanted to try to see if I could deliver the same outcomes, the same credibility, the same pace of change in a very different environment. I guess it was about always wanting to test myself of, okay, fine, well, I might be able to do it at a NatWest or a City, but can I do it in the Middle East? Can I do it in a startup environment? Can I do it in the challenger bank that I'm in today? So I think by being in those different types of environments, I've had to be able to flex. And I think if I'd have always worked for one type of organization, I wouldn't have that same skill set, which is also something I look for on CVs. So that doesn't mean I wouldn't hire someone that had done 30 years at a big bank at all. I'm not saying that, but I would definitely delve through that conversation with that individual into, okay, could they work in a different environment? Because they're so vastly different if you were coming into a challenger bank from that environment. So I encourage people to try and force themselves outside the comfort zones into those different environments, because you build that skill set of being able to really flex.
But you got to have the opportunity to do it, right?
Yeah.
And how did those opportunities come up for you? Were you opportunistic in that sense?
Yeah, I think so. So I know you say you've got to have those opportunities, but I would probably be a bit direct and say, but you have to create those opportunities,
of course.
Right? So you have to think about what is it you want, and where do you want to go?
Yeah.
And I think you do have to create some of those opportunities. I think you have to be willing to take risk. And I don't think that's that's calculated risk, of course, because we've all got families and commitments and accountabilities. But I think you need to really think about what are the kind of new muscles that you need to develop. So if you want to be on the C-suite or a CEO one day, you've got to be able to not just have one single style, in my opinion. You've got to be able to run a potentially extremely large teams of different people and to motivate them and bring them on journeys. So I think that ability to really think, okay, where do I need to develop a different type of muscle? And not everyone would want to go and work internationally. I would recommend it, by the way, for people. I think it's a great opportunity to learn something really new and different.
Okay.
But, I think you do have to force yourself out your comfort zone. That's probably a mantra I absolutely have lived my life by, so personal life and career.
Love it. And I'm keen to dive into the international experience in a moment. I suppose just to flip that on its head for a second though, have you ever said no to something that you've ended up regretting?
So I was headhunted for a role in Qatar.
Right.
And I said, and at the same time, by a big private bank in London.
Right.
And I wanted international experience, but the big private bank in London was going to give me international experience, but based in London. And that obviously felt safer and kind of more of a known
you were here.
entity, and we were here at the time. Or it was like, uplift the family and we go and move abroad. And actually, I said no to the Qatar opportunity. I just thought it was too big a risk. It just it feels just get outside your comfort zone, Sharon, but that feels like a step too far. And so I stayed and I did the role in the private bank, which was an international role. And actually, I really regretted it after 12, 13 months because actually it meant traveling quite a lot, which I know is obvious, but I had a young child at the time, and that was then genuinely taking me away from him for a week, 10 days at a time, which I wasn't comfortable with. Whereas if we'd all gone to a country, we'd have at least been together. And then much more importantly, I think, sorry, that's not to sound negative to being a good mum, but actually the bank that I went to work for decided that they were divesting from all the international markets. So I was like, oh, okay, but then where's all my international experience going to come from? And it just so happened, I literally bumped into the headhunter in London who had introduced me to the Qatar opportunity and said, how's it going? And I said, I made the wrong choice.
Right.
I really think I should have taken the role that you had introduced me to. And she said, they haven't filled it and the CEO really loved you. Do you want me to get you connected again?
Oh, wow.
And so difficult decision for your CV because I'd therefore only done 13 months with this organization. But I would rather bite the bullet and kind of do the right thing. And so then that basically, long story short, we ended up, that's what we did. But so, I absolutely got that wrong and I should have taken more risk.
Yeah, I mean, you say difficult decision for your CV, but completely justifiable as well, right? So, I mean, not really in the long run.
No.
And okay, so do you think at that point then, when you said no and you stayed in London, obviously context aside for a second, did you then have that scratch that you hadn't quite itched and it was like, right, I need to fulfill this at some point. I need to do this.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, fine. Yeah. That's really interesting. So then looking at the move, obviously at that point you had a young family.
Yes.
I'm assuming that was a difficult decision. What was the tipping point in the end? Was it the experience of being overseas and being based somewhere else from a career perspective? Was it the opportunity to move your family? How did you reconcile all of that?
I think it was the experience. So I really wanted that international experience from a career perspective. And the reason for that is, I felt like I'd done well in the UK. My career had accelerated quickly through my time with Citi. And I really wanted to go and see if I could do kind of this, but in a very different culture, a very different environment. So that was the driver. But then it also gave the whole family the opportunity to have a very different experience. Our child at the time was 18 months, 2 years by the time we actually moved there, 18 months when we started sort of really considering it. And it felt therefore quite risk-free from his perspective because he technically wasn't really going to understand what was happening. And if we ended up coming home quickly, we came home quickly. So I think it was everything. I think it was career and family, the sort of opportunity that would give us. I think naively on the personal side, I hadn't realized how big a change it would be for us. And I hadn't really perhaps thought that through. So you lose your entire support network, let's be clear. So we did have family close by in the UK, lots of friends, had a good job in London at the time. My husband had a very stable business. And it was kind of, you're throwing all that up in the air. And then it's just the three of you out there. And if things go wrong or someone's sick or, I've got lots of pressures at work, it's just you. So that's quite tough. And I think you have to, we probably as a couple didn't mentally prepare ourselves as much as we should have for that.
Right. So you threw yourself in and then kind of realized once you'd thrown yourself in that it was a bigger project than you maybe had anticipated.
Yeah. Well, I think joining any new bank in a big new role, I think is a big thing.
Of
so
course.
We will have that's always like, it's not just a career decision for me. There's a family conversation that goes, are you ready for me now not to be mentally present for the next 6 months or so? Because I am going to be I might be physically present, but I'm going to be full on into this role. I'll be well outside my comfort zone, ideally, because that's why I'm taking the role, because I want to push myself. So I'll be outside my comfort zone, and therefore I'm not going to be as present. So I think like when you're doing that and then you've moved country and therefore there's a lot of pressure on your other half, because they need to find a home, they need to find nurseries, they need to forward apply for schools to make sure there's a school for your child to start going to. And they were in high demand in Qatar. It's really difficult to get into like the best schools and things. Yet there's a lot going on that you're not, you kind of, until you get there, you go, oh yeah. And that just practicalities. You need, your residency, you need your licenses, you need new driving tests. I mean, there's loads of things that need to be done. And yeah, I've gone in the mindset still like I would in London of, I need to be left alone now for 6 months. I've got to get on with my job. And it's like, oh, actually, there's a huge amount at home that needs sorting here.
Yeah. And from a professional career perspective, what's the upshot of all of that? How do you think it impacted the kind of trajectory of your career from then onwards?
So it continued to really build on my career. It gave me new skills in terms of working in a very different environment, very different culture. It definitely gave me opportunity to what I call flex my leadership style, and the need to flex my leadership style, because my very direct London style just didn't work over there, to be very blunt.
How long did it take you to figure that out?
It took me a good 2-3 months.
Right.
Yeah, I just couldn't work it out. Why is everyone not just doing what needs to be done? Why are the teams not responding? So yeah, it was like one of those. I think I kind of woke up and was like, I was kind of banging my head against a brick wall here. Why am I doing this to myself? Like change, so do it differently.
And what did differently practically look like?
It practically looked like Sharon slowing down and taking a step back and spending time building relationships, particularly with the local females that worked in the organisation, because they could help me really understand from a cultural perspective how to navigate the organisation and the country. That was really incredibly helpful, but that really took time to step back from. I think from the more male perspective, it was around building credibility. So in Qatar, the chap I worked for was fantastic and always made sure I had a clear voice at the table. I had opportunity to really demonstrate what I was capable of. So that didn't take so long to build, but it was more about building trust with your colleagues in the organisation. Why were you there? Were you just another expat that was popping in and out? You'd be gone in 2 years. Were you really committed to the organisation? Were you really committed to the medium term? So yeah, I think it just took time to build that level of relationship.
And it's a mindset shift as much as anything else, I guess, for you personally. But it's interesting because I think there will be people that will listen to this podcast who are exploring the idea, particularly in the Middle East. I think we are seeing a huge increase in demand and interest in the Middle East. Obviously, there's the tax benefits as much as anything else, right? I think there are reasons people are looking overseas from the UK right now, particularly from a tax perspective. So it's interesting to get that kind of steer, the like real life on the ground experience of actually the culture is very, very different, and you have to adapt your style. So once you've built the relationships and you're on the ground and you've really started to get that momentum, then what happens next? How did you then start to develop and progress in your career? Because obviously in that 6.5 year period, you obviously grew quite significantly professionally, right? So what would you put that down to?
So I think you build the momentum, you build the credibility. So for me, then it becomes all about outcomes and performance. So the business performed incredibly well. We did a huge amount of digital transformation. So when I arrived in Qatar, they had lots of branches and I mean, lots of people queued outside of them, etc. So there was a huge amount we did to transform the whole digital usage to encourage people to not be going to branches, to develop mobile apps, etc. So there was a lot that you could do. There was so much opportunity. We delivered. One of the things I developed was a whole new proposition for expatriates moving to the country, because I was really passionate about this. I'd been through it and it's really difficult and there's so many things to think about. So we did this really unique proposition that was way beyond banking, but obviously captured the banking element, but then also allowed you to be really helped by the bank on a number of different matters, all about moving to, we called it Life in Qatar. So
amazing.
So there was lots of opportunity to develop really innovative propositions. So I think in terms of my development, you just built momentum and you kept building and you kept delivering more and more results for the organization. But importantly, you couldn't just, the point I made earlier around building the relationship, you can't just kind of build that relationship and then the momentum gets going and then drop it and go back to London style, if I can call it that. I mean, that muscle of continuously keeping those relationships warm, helping others. I used to work quite closely in the end with some of the local females there as well. So just culturally, it was more difficult for them perhaps to be challenging in the room.
Right.
So I used to work with a couple of them and talk to them before. Okay, what's the concerns? What points are you trying to get across? How can I be in the room? And perhaps because culturally I'm able to do that with my expatriate boss, that's fine. I can go in and I can ask that question and I can push on these matters. So it was about kind of building relationship and even over there thinking, how can I further help females to be able to develop, to get a voice at the table?
Amazing. Which I imagine was a different challenge
very different, right? Very different in terms of the way you had to do it. And also, I mean, over there for me, you also have to accept that you are living in a completely different environment.
Of course.
So, there were points that I couldn't have a voice at the table. So a good example of that is during Ramadan over there. So a lot of the really big clients, the sheikhs, are met during Ramadan in the majlis, okay? And women aren't allowed. So I couldn't have a seat at the table. I couldn't be involved in that really key business development period. And then you have to think, okay, how can I influence differently? So how can you influence from behind the scenes? How can you still be an enabler for growth? How can I support my boss and the team to ensure that they can do what needs to be done that I can't do? Right. So you could get quite disheartened by that. But actually, I think because, you're in a different country, you embrace that and you need to find different ways to have impact. So it's also good because it teaches you, how do I have impact from behind the scenes? That's not something I'd had to do before, if that makes sense. But you do go through that kind of month period where that is how it works, and you can't change that.
And culture aside, so we've talked a lot about the cultural differences, and I think some of those are probably relatively obvious, or people would make assumptions around what those cultural differences are. What about from an actual kind of environment perspective, when you think about bureaucracy or red tape or governance or like the way things actually work? Did you find that the mode of operation was different? Was it faster, slower? Or?
In the country generally?
Yes.
In the bank?
In the bank. In financial services.
In financial services. So it could be slower, if that makes sense. But I think what we tried to bring as a team at that time to the organisation was to really bring pace of change and to really ensure that we were bringing people on a journey and that we weren't getting kind of what I call caught up in governance or not being able to move forward and deliver. So I don't think I would say that felt wildly different actually to what you do over here. The piece that was really challenging is obviously over here I can talk directly to my regulators and have a conversation whenever I need to. And although over there I could talk to the regulator, and I did on occasions, it was actually all in Arabic. So I would go with my compliance director and then you would kind of have a conversation through someone, if that makes sense. Really? So what I don't like about that is that's that slight loss of control of, are they really getting my message across properly? Yeah, how do you really know the interpretation of what's being said?
Yes.
So that I think was challenging. But I think both Qatar and Dubai are both countries that massively embrace innovation. They embrace change, and therefore actually it makes them really exciting environments to have worked in during that period.
Right.
And the pace of change actually was fast, right? I mean, what we delivered in the few years we were there was significant. So they had deep pockets, which at the time, particularly in the UK, most banks didn't have.
Of course.
And they had a really positive attitude towards innovation and change. But yeah, the regulatory piece was always more challenging.
It's challenging, yeah. Well, all of that continues, right? I think the deep pockets are still there. The investment is still there. The pace of change is arguably maybe even faster right now, right? So no, that's really helpful. What made you come back?
So secondary school, we said we'd come back before secondary school. And that isn't because I don't think the education over there is good enough for secondary school. It's because for me, I didn't want any movement or change for him during secondary school, because obviously you're getting to the point of GCSEs and then obviously moving on to A levels. So just wanted to make sure that it was that absolute stability.
Mm.
And I think it's difficult when you're abroad, or certainly in the Middle East. I don't think you can ever be 100% sure of that stability. And so therefore, we'd always said that that would be the right point in time for us to return.
And did you come back without a role, or you lined that up before you
I
you landed
did.
back? Right.
So, and it's very surprising. So my husband didn't expect me to do that. But I tell you why I did it. So I'd always gone from role to role, and actually had a relatively short time off from maternity leave.
Okay.
So about 5 months, 5.5 months,
Right.
because I was obsessed. I had to get back for my career. I was in a very big, aggressive, male-dominated bank. And
Yeah.
so I'd never really taken much of a break. And then obviously, we landed in Qatar. I started work the next day. When we went from Qatar to Dubai, we flew from Qatar to Dubai. We landed, I started work the next day.
Right.
And I just said to my husband, you know what? I just want to be a mum that actually is the one to settle him into school for once. You've done 2 of them. I've not done any of that. I don't feel like I've done any of that for him.
Yeah.
I want to do that. So yes, we came home and I didn't have a role, and I didn't look for anything actually, to be honest, till about the sort of October, November time. And I started in Jan ultimately.
Wow.
So I had a few months off.
A proper sabbatical.
And I was mum. Yeah. I was the one that settled him into school, and
yeah,
it was nice.
And how did that? So when you think about that now, does that have any bearing on your overall career when you look at it like from a big picture perspective?
What, taking that time?
Yeah.
No, so none
not.
at all. And yet, if you think back to the comment I just made about my maternity leave, I was hysterical about taking maternity leave because I was
Right.
going to ruin my career and what would happen, right? And that's so, when I look back, I just think,
Yeah.
why, Sharon?
Yeah.
And yeah, I would never have been brave enough earlier in my career to have done something like that.
Right.
But you get to a point in your career where you're like, no, this is fine, and had absolutely no bearing on my career at all. And it was great for me to have the opportunity to do that with him.
I bet.
It was a special time. It also taught me that I'm a much better mum when I am working as well, and I've got something for myself, because once he was in school, as you know, they disappear off and you don't pick them up again till 3 or 3:30. So I'm quite a pacey person. I was bored out my mind during the day. The dogs were like overwalked. I didn't know what else to do. The house was overcleaned. So it actually, in a way, it's quite good for me as well. I do need and want to be working.
You need the pace,
But it was nice to have the opportunity to do that and settle him.
Very cool. Very cool. And look, the other thing that we talked about in our preparation, and you kind of nodded to this being a particular skill set that you leverage all the time, that you think makes you a really effective leader, it's storytelling, right? And I think storytelling is, it's one of those things that probably most people think they can do, but actually it's really, really difficult to do it well, right? I think you talked about you use this in your town halls, you use it when you're getting your teams together, you even use it in smaller groups. So how did you establish that was a particular skill that you needed to develop, first of all? And then actually, how did you go about developing that as a skill set?
I think because I guess you think what kind of has motivated you through your career, and when have you felt most motivated and most willing to sort of go above and beyond. And that's been when I understand where I'm going, why I'm doing what I'm doing, what the cause is.
Yeah.
And I call myself kind of customer obsessed. So why is it great for the customer? Like, I really need to understand that. So part of it's been because it just felt like that's what gets the best out of me, rather than just telling someone go do X, but you don't really know why. And then also perhaps an example is I worked once for a CEO, and his vision was 2 billion, and that was it, 2 billion. I didn't want any other words because, and I get it, it's important, it's short, we need to be able to remember it. But 2 billion, like, what does that even mean? it's fine, 2 billion, but what does that mean? 2 billion revenue, is that good for the customer, or does it mean for the experience? Like, there was no vision, right? It was just the vision was a number in a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And, you learn from experience. And what you saw during that period was people just didn't pull in the same direction. They weren't galvanized around a message. They weren't galvanized around a story. They didn't know why or where they were going. And so it doesn't get the best out of people. And so for me, I think it's really important to win the hearts and minds of people. And it sounds a little bit sad, and I'm not sure I'll ever quite achieve it, but I kind of want people to be as excited as I am about work. And I made a comment last week in the office, and a couple of people looked at me like, really? I said, I wish there were a few more days this week. I just got more work to do. Could do with some more days in the week. And a couple of people went, yeah, no, I'm quite glad it's the weekend tomorrow, actually.
I love that.
But I kind of want people to feel that passion.
Yeah.
And I think you've got, you need to tell people the why and why it's going to be so good for customers and why that's going to be wanted for customers. And, also part of the storytelling and the strategy is, what does it mean for colleagues and why is it good for colleagues? How does it make their life better? How does it give them more opportunity to develop? How does it give them more satisfaction in what they're doing every day?
Yeah.
I just think it's so important to get that energy.
And for you, is it about real life examples rather than, like you say, kind of, the mission, the vision, the values? That stuff's important, but actually it only really comes to life when you can share those examples and you can spotlight particular achievements and it has to be personal, right?
Yeah, so I think you definitely need that really clear vision and mission, but I think it's in everything you do every day, bringing back the day-to-day stuff that people are doing at their desk.
Yeah.
How's that tying back? So you're just constantly bringing it back to, why are you doing what you're doing and how is that contributing towards the vision and the mission?
Yeah.
And I think in the storytelling, where the storytelling really comes alive is, as you were saying, is with real examples. So where you can credibly, and again, when you build a strategy, I always think it's really important. You might have a big 3-5 year strategy and that's where we're going to be in our 3 years, right? But okay, so if we're going to be there in 3 years, then what I like to translate that to is, so what does that mean the business will look like in 6 weeks?
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean we'll have done in the next 4 weeks? What does that mean you're going to do this week?
Yeah.
Like bring it all the way back down of what does it mean? What's the so what for me? And a nice way to break it down into storytelling is also, what does it mean for the customer? So if that's the bank we want to be in 3 years, what do I want my customer to be saying about me in 3 months? Like, what do I want them to feel and what do I want them to say about me? What should the experience really feel like?
Love it.
So really bringing it down to experiences, and I think making sure you've got really credible milestones. That, again, creates that job satisfaction, that personal satisfaction. If you do we're going to do a massive transformation, it'll all be done in 2 years, everyone. Through that 2 years, people just feel exhausted, like they're constantly chasing a goal that's 2 years out. You know, am I really getting there? How do I know I'm getting there? And then sometimes you get to the end of your 2 years and you're like, oh, we didn't get there. So you've got to do those milestone checks on the way. Yeah.
And what happens when you're breaking it down and, people are driving at their 2 week sprint and they don't hit it? They've got their 3 to 5 objectives, they're nowhere near, or maybe they've hit one and the other 4, they're well off the mark. How do you respond to that?
I think it depends on the circumstance. So I think first and foremost is, I always say to my guys, like, whatever we plan, it's pretty certain it won't come out as we plan, right? It's not going to happen to plan exactly, So again, I want to be aspirational in our plans. I think I always try to make sure we're really kind of raising the bar in terms of where we're trying to get to, because there is a possibility you might fall a bit short of that bar. So it's kind of, I'm a contingency person for sure, right? So I always try and build some contingency into that. I think if people aren't making the milestones, then I think it's about trying to think about why, what have been the things that have been the frustration or have caused the blocker for us not to be able to make it. So I think you've got to be able to sit down and be able to flex as well. So you might have said, okay, the vision is X and we're going to go on this path to get there. And you have to be able to self-reflect and say, as a team, okay, that's not working. So we might actually have to change course and go a slightly different route or take a different tack to get there.
Yeah.
So I think that's important. So I think allowing people to fail without feeling like they're going to get fired the next day because of it, right? So you do have to allow a bit of that, right?
Of course.
Everything shouldn't be gold-plated. You've got to get some stuff out the door. You need to do that safely, of course, but you've got to get some stuff out the door to really see what's working.
Right.
The ability to be able to really flex the direction that you're going in if you need to change direction. And then also sometimes you can find people aren't hitting milestones because actually maybe your own comms isn't good enough, right? Maybe you haven't been clear enough in the direction that's needed. So just checking back, does everyone really understand what we're trying to do and where we're trying to get to?
Right. It's so cool. And the whole customer obsession piece is It's interesting because everybody talks about being customer centric, right? But what does it actually mean to be customer centric? It means you have to care. It's a mental thing as much as anything else, isn't it? And I think if you really care and you've got that passion and belief, then actually your customer senses that, right?
Yeah.
Half the time. We changed our whole thinking actually recently. It used to be about white glove service. And then we kind of recognized that actually it's not necessarily about white glove service. It's about delivering what the customer needs and wants when they want it and need it, right?
Yeah.
And it is that level of kind of really wanting to give them the best service possible. And yes, that might turn out to be white glove service, but actually it's just about that's what they want, that's what they need. But how do you deal with when you're in an organization and you've got peers or you've got subordinates who don't have that same level of care, which, you know, is quite common, right?
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
So I think for me, I always think the best way to really bring... So if you join an organisation, and as you say, it often happens, you're talking about the numbers. Talk about the numbers. What's the numbers for the quarter? What's the numbers? And they're not talking about the customer. I think it's about really bringing credibility to the table that if you have customers who are satisfied with your products, who you're meeting their needs, if you design products that meet their needs, then that itself is what actually drives your numbers. So it's trying to get the organization to think about it from a different angle. One of the ways I've done that in the organizations where I've needed to, and some I haven't so much, and some I have had to a lot, is really to actually kind of say the first thing that we should do, if you're kind of in an exco meeting, the first thing you should talk about is the customer. So start with the customer always. And then I think start translating where the customer benefit is then translating into your revenue numbers. So if you've got a board or a CEO that really wants to focus on the numbers, and there's nothing wrong with that. The commercial outturn is important. Yeah. But the commercial outturn, like I was saying earlier, if you focus on the 2 billion, what does that mean, right? If you focus on delivering exceptional customer outcomes, you'll get to that number. But you just need to make sure that you are showing the translation from that customer satisfaction, from that proposition development, when you've developed the proposition, what's it really bringing to the P&L, what's it bringing to the balance sheet, etc. So it's just translating the customer outcome into a number. And then it helps to make that click for someone. And then you'll tend to find people are very happy to always start with talking about the customer.
I hear you, yeah. But sometimes there's a long tail to that, right?
Yeah.
And in a smaller organization, is it easier or harder to invest in that tail where you're confident that a proposition is going to lead to top line, bottom line revenue, but it might take a bit of time and you've got to get people engaged in that journey and you can't directly demonstrate the numbers straight away. Is that an easier thing to do in a smaller business, do you find?
I guess, yeah. So in a sort of smaller or medium-sized business, I think you can argue it's easier because you can get right to the top quicker, if that makes sense. So I can go and have those conversations at a board level. I can have conversations with our NEDs one-on-one. I can do that with the chairman and the shareholders, etc. So if I were in a Citigroup, for example, I wouldn't be able to do that, right? So it's much harder to do it through a really large organization. So I think it is definitely easier through a small and medium-sized organization. I think it's about, again, it goes back to kind of active listening and empathy. So if you feel like, there are people around the table who kind of don't want to talk about the customer, it's a bit of understanding their why. So what is it they're missing or not understanding about the benefit of talking about the customer? Because if you can understand why they don't want to or what it is they're obsessed about, of course. And then how can you translate, it goes back to storytelling, how can you translate that story of the customer into helping their obsession or their area of focus, then you get their attention. So it does also take a bit of a step back of, okay, what is the most important thing to this individual? I can hear that. Okay, how do I translate that back to the customer? And then credibly show them that there is benefit in doing this.
Consultative selling. That's exactly what it is.
And also, I know, people sometimes kind of say, there's lots of regulation. But actually, I think Consumer Duty has been brilliant for this. So, it's not talking about, just treating customers fairly. It is about delivering good consumer outcomes, good customer outcomes. And I think that has helped across the industry in terms of making sure organizations are really talking about what is the customer outcome, not just, are we treating all customers equally and fairly? Is it driving a good customer outcome or not? So that's also forced the hands of those organizations that don't want to talk about the customer perhaps as much.
Right.
And I think it's actually been a really helpful tool that we've all embedded.
Yeah, that's nice. I think, some better than others, nonetheless. But okay, cool. And then just the last bit that I was really keen to talk about then. So if you look forward now and you think about financial services, we're in a really interesting period of transformation. There's been a period of modernization. There's been investment in digital technologies. There's AI coming into the foreground more and more now, right? Lots of companies are starting to get some real use cases off the floor. So what do you see happening in the next 5 years? What do you see as the interesting trends across the banking sector specifically?
I still think there's a lot more that you could see in terms of the kind of banking world and the wealth management space and how those could really, really come together. And I think, again, AI could really be helpful in terms of driving strong partnerships. I don't think... So I'm not one of these people that think there'll be no jobs left in financial services because AI will be doing it all at all. I really do think that the AI means that it will supercharge the colleagues in the organization. And I really do think, therefore, it could mean like an organization like ours, maybe we can triple the size of the business, but the technology will keep the cost flat, for example. That's kind of, just an example. But I think, therefore, that scalability, and I think those that don't do that and those that aren't looking at that will get left behind.
Of course. And I think it's going to happen quickly as well, right?
Yeah. AI has actually been around for a really long time,
right,
so we're all talking about it like it's still quite new. It's quite new,
of course.
But it's not as we spent kind of 3 hours in a workshop on it last week, and when you think about how long it's actually been around and where it's been used, it's not as new as we all are looking at it. It's just the financial services industry probably hasn't been as quick to embrace it.
Yeah, and the use cases are more obvious now and clearer, and also delivering better benefits, right? I think arguably, so and that drives momentum, doesn't it? But no, okay, great. I agree. I think it's interesting to see the impact that it's having. I think there's been a bit of a frenzy, but in reality, some of that has calmed down now, and we're starting to see the actual opportunities, right? There's a ton of opportunities in the engineering space as well. I think just in terms of, again, supercharging some of those engineers to be better at their job, right?
One of the things we were talking about the other day in the workshop, which I think is interesting, is kind of a question. Just a question comes to you, raised. We were talking about the use of AI for colleagues. So obviously, it can make what you are doing day to day much quicker, much more efficient. But there's a level of how far would you let that go? Because the AI itself can then mean there is lack of diversity of thought. Right?
Of course.
So that in itself, I think, is something that organizations need to be really thoughtful about. And we're using quite a lot of AI at the moment and starting to embed AI in terms of our processes and how colleagues use it so that they are able to do more value-creating tasks than administrative tasks. But we do need to be really thoughtful about, if the AI starts doing and making decisions on certain things, that's rule-based, that we've put in place. But where's the diversity of thinking? Where's the challenge around that? So I think you've got to make sure that you always bring back to whatever the AI output is, that you've still got that diverse lens on it.
Yeah, a human in the loop.
Yeah.
Of course. No, very good. Well, look, we've covered a broad range of topics there. I think it's great to have you today, and thank you for being so open. It was a fantastic conversation, and I hope everybody else enjoyed it as well.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.